Hi, I'm Ryan Shore. I scored the music for Warner Brothers' Trick or Treat Scooby-Doo, and you're listening to a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
The gang's all here, they're on the case, and there's no ghost that they wouldn't face, 'cause they dig it, Scooby-Doo. Yeah, they dig it, Scooby-Doo.
Hey, gang, and welcome to another episode of a podcast named Scooby-Doo, the show that delves into the rich 80-plus year history of Hanna-Barbera and Scooby-Doo media. Join me, Mike Josick, and my various guests as each episode we take a deep dive into the rich tapestry of classic cartoons, iconic characters, and the lasting animated legacy of William Hanna and Joseph Barbera. So fire up the mystery machine, grab yourself some Scooby snacks, and let's start the show.
All right. Line up. I've got an announcement. Oh, I can hardly wait. What is it, sir? We're all ears. Command and we obey.
Welcome to episode 55 of the podcast. For those of you familiar with my show, you probably know it's been a while since I've had a new episode up. Definitely feels good to be back. Also feels good to be presenting to you my guest today, Greg Ehrbar. For those of you who are used to hanging out in nerd spaces, are big fans of Hanna-Barbera, classic television, or theme parks, you've probably run across Greg's work online or at your local bookseller. But for those of you who are maybe unfamiliar with Greg, he is a two-time Grammy Award nominee and winner of the Addy Award for advertising. He's a writer, commentator for television. He's worked for Disney, Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, Universal, and the Television Academy. He also hosts a couple of podcasts, one of which is quite germane to the subject today. It's called the Funtastic World of Hanna and Barbera, where Greg talks to people who have worked in some capacity with Hanna-Barbera. Sounds kind of familiar. And for any of his non-Hanna-Barbera proclivities, he has another show called the Pop Culture Classics Podcast, where he talks about television, film, stage, theme parks, etc., etc. Greg has also written a few books, including Mousetracks, the story of Walt Disney Records, and Inside the Whimsy Works, My Life with Disney Productions. He joins me today to talk about his latest book, Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History, From Modern Stone Age to Meddling Kids. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. It is very well researched. It is very accessible to read, and it is a great reference book for anybody interested in Hanna-Barbera history, or more specifically, the audio production that the studio was involved in, whether that be voice recording, sound effects, or the many Hanna-Barbera records that came out through labels like Colpix or Peter Pan. You're probably familiar with them, you've seen them online, or maybe you had some as a kid. I had a great conversation with Greg. We talked for well over 2 hours, so I took the liberty of splitting the interview into two parts. It actually had a really nice dividing line about an hour in, and we spent about the first hour talking primarily about HB history and the studio and the legacy. We'll talk a little bit about the book, but the book more specifically kind of gets covered in part two. So just so you're aware, if you're listening to this part and you're kind of like, why aren't they talking about the book? That's why. We talk about it about an hour in, we start to really get into it. Anyways, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't really want to dwell much more on the preamble here. So I'm just going to thank you for checking out the podcast again and joining me here for part one of my conversation with writer, podcaster Greg Ehrbar. Kick back, relax, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, Greg, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
What a lot of people probably don't know is that this was a conversation we'd actually had scheduled for about a year ago, and stuff just happened. And as I was telling you kind of off mic, when I was kind of ramping up, you were the number one person that I wanted to get on the show, because this is kind of like where we left off. So there's some nice connective tissue there for me. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back on the show and talk about your book.
Yeah, I'm very, very happy. Thanks for saying that. I'm very honored.
Now, I'm really curious. The Recorded History, Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History is the name of the book. Ultimately, it is a history, an exploration of not only the music, but also sound effects, just kind of like the whole audio soundscape of Hanna-Barbera, from basically Joe and Bill at MGM to, I'm trying to think, what was the last show that you touched on?
The Tom and Jerry movie in 2021.
That's right. That's right. Oh, it's a nice little bookend there, Tom and Jerry to Tom.
Oh,
and
yeah,
Jerry.
yeah.
How does one get interested in such a specific niche kind of side of the industry and of this particular studio?
Well, I have an interest in a lot of various kinds of animation and film and television, but there are certain things that are near and dear to my heart. One of them is Hanna-Barbera, and I have loved the work they have done since I was a kid, as many of us had. And I continue to love the work that they did into the 70s and in the 80s. And I love the feature films, and I love the direct to videos. There is very little of Hanna-Barbera that I really don't like. It's hard to pick something. The Hanna-Barbera Happy Hour wasn't all that great with the puppets, but but I still watched it. And I just think that there's something very purely entertaining about what they've done. It's an enormous amount of work, and the way I got really attached to Hanna-Barbera was through their records. And they used to have their own record company, and the records were not sold, at least where I grew up, in very many places. So it became, and there were the pictures of all the other ones on the back cover. So it became this sort of treasure hunt throughout my life to track down each and every one of them. And they were not like other records. There were similarities, but they were just really unique because they often had the original cast, but even if they didn't, these were still the top voice people recording these things, as I found out, right along with the cartoons. They produced these albums in the studio on 3400 Cahuenga, and the editors edited them just like they were a cartoon on 35-inch mag tape. The songs were recorded elsewhere, but they were edited in the same way. So the effects and the music were the genuine article, and that didn't always happen with records. And I just liked the kind of humor that was on them. Sometimes they were fully serious, but they just were special to me. Now, I loved other records as well. I have a very, very large album and CD collection, 45s and 78s and all that stuff. And so, I mean, I've also co-written a book about Disney records. But the book about Disney records is really about that division, the in-house Disney record division. That's called Mousetracks. The Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History, started to be pretty much about records. But the more I was writing it and the more I was researching it, the more I found out that there's so much more story to tell. And there's so few books out there that aren't beautiful coffee table books, aside from the two autobiographies that Joe Barbera and Bill Hanna did. There's not a book that just tells the entire story. So it grew from just records and just their label to everything they did from before they even met in the 30s to the first record that was generated by an H&B project, which was the King That Couldn't Dance from Anchors Away, that was made into a record. And then the last thing covered is the Tom and Jerry movie soundtrack from 2021. But those are just your thread through what became a much bigger story. We told the whole story of Bill and Joe and their great artists at MGM and then at their own company, and went through this enormous body of work. And if you just look at the chapters, those who aren't familiar with how much Hanna-Barbera did will probably go, I didn't know they made that, or I didn't know this existed. I pretty much hung on every single show they ever did and movie. I went to see The Man Called Flintstone in the theater. At every matinee they showed it on. And I have memorized quite a few episodes. As well, you were into Scooby-Doo, you probably have as well. So I know there's something about their characters and the way they tell stories that is very unique, in that the characters are very vivid. And even if they're similar, even though, okay, Funky Phantom is basically Scooby and all of that, it doesn't really matter. There's just something very delightful about the way they produce a cartoon, the way everything falls together. And in writing this, I also gained an enormous amount of respect. And it's also become a bit of a cause to show what a tremendous amount of fine quality work they did with such an enormous amount of pressure from time, from budget, from interference from networks and sponsors and various pressure groups. When you look at what they made, especially Saturday mornings, and how good it is, considering it was made at a breakneck pace, and everybody was looking at it and changing it and all that. It's one thing to put together a feature every few years or a short every few months, but having to put out a handful of shows by a tight deadline, that is a miracle. So when you look at a show like Hong Kong Phooey or the various Scoobies, or, there's innovation too. They don't get enough credit for innovation. The Flintstones was more than just the first primetime animated sitcom, and it was way more than just an animated Honeymooners. I see that on Facebook all the time. It's just the Honeymooners. Flintstones was inspired by the Honeymooners, but Bill and Joe were very unpretentious about that sort of thing, and they said, "Yeah, it's a compliment if people think that." They didn't go, "Oh no, what's the Honeymooners? I don't know what that is. No, we had no idea." They just, "Oh yeah, okay." And the fact that they say Gleason decided not to sue them because he didn't want kids to be mad at him may be true, but the other fact is that Gleason himself was sued because the Honeymooners was very much like a radio show called The Bickersons, and he settled out of court. Aha. So you can't point to anything in television especially, but even in motion pictures, that isn't derivative in some way. And what Hanna-Barbera did and had to do was work within a system that sold shows that fit in with what programming was looking for at the time, and the kind of styles, the kind of just the kind of thing that was going at the time. So it wasn't that they wanted to churn out 20 different Scooby shows. It was that the networks asked for that. And if you look at network television, that's exactly what they do. And now if you look at movies, sequels, prequels, remakes, it's just the nature of the beast. The longer the history of filmed entertainment is, it's just the way it's done. Yeah. So it is pretty remarkable. I'm looking at some of these things on MeTV Tunes now, and I've got the videos and stuff, but it's so cool that they're being broadcast again, and in much better restored condition. They're beautiful to look at. The backgrounds on, like, if you look at the Scooby background, especially in Where Are You and stuff, those are lush. That's a Disney artist. That is, his name escapes me, but he was a renowned background artist. Walt Paragoy was the one who did a lot of those. And even if the backgrounds are simple,
interesting interview to listen to.
Oh, he has a salty tongue, I believe, from what I've heard. Yes, but he's brilliant. And not only that, but even if a background is sparse and simple, it still uses now that we have TVs that pick all this up, you see magentas and you see, shades of blue and things that they put in there back when your TV couldn't work that, you couldn't get those shades. So you look at
backgrounds, and like you look at the Yogi Bear backgrounds, you look at the Top Cat backgrounds, and like those, you could put any of those next to any of like Maurice Noble's Warner Brothers cartoons, and like they're all gorgeous.
Yeah, they are. And sometimes when you're watching them, you take for granted that if you isolate a frame, how beautiful those are. You
Yeah.
know, and what's fun about HB cartoons is that you can do that because usually there's going to be an errant frame where nothing's on the screen. So you can, you know, there's car crashes or whatever. Crashes always take place off screen. So you get a chance to take a look at that background. And they're gorgeous, and they're also they're varied. I mean, the Flintstones evolved over the years to a certain kind of background, and now that I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, well, the Flintstone comedy show or the new Fred and Barney show, they're not the same as the Flintstones. Now I'm looking back and saying, well, why should they be? There's 166 of the original. Take a look at the look of the Fred and Barney show and how lush it is, because they knew TVs could pick it up more. I still love the simple, I like that blue look, that cool look of the early shows. But what they did later was really nice. And maybe it didn't have to even be that nice, but they had quite often some of the best people in the entire industry, thousands of them, at a time when, especially in the 70s, when studios were barely hiring artists. Sometimes maybe 75 or so might be in a studio doing animation, where at Hanna-Barbera there was almost 2,000 at any given time in the 70s. And they were not ageist because they hired young people, and for a while they did a lot of training. There's a lot of information about that. They tried to keep that going, and they hired people other studios wouldn't hire because of their health, or that they were simply old. And some people like Tex Avery and Ken Muse, who was with them forever, and Irv Spence. And then if you look at the credits of an episode, you know, you may or may not think the cartoon's great, but take a look at those credits. It's Fleischer, it's Lance, you know, it's
Mike
Disney.
Maltese.
Yeah,
That's not something that I argue often, is that yes, those early shows were very simple, or they look simply animated because they were working on a certain production schedule and had certain demands. But the people that were working on them were people who were used to doing things like the Warner Brothers cartoons or Disney features. And so they were bringing so much skill and artistry. And I think because they were used to operating at such a high level, they were able to simplify things in such a way that it didn't create a diminished product. It was
right.
something that was, how are we going to do this that it's going to work and still be good? I think what a lot of people think about when they're thinking about the crappy Hanna-Barbera, you know, limited animation look, is they are thinking about, you know, moving into the 70s, where they were just producing a lot of stuff, and they were bringing literally people off the street and training them how to do in-betweens and stuff like that. But again, I've heard you tell the story many times. I've heard the story elsewhere many, many times about, that was a place that just hired people. That was a place that gave people jobs and kept people working. And the Mark Evanier story about,
Yeah.
you know, Bill Hanna saying, which of these people do you want me to fire? And it's hard.
Yeah, and for those who haven't heard that, for those who don't know that story, Mark basically said, maybe you should lighten the load, and maybe you could focus a little bit more on details if you didn't have so many shows. And he said, yeah, we could cut out a series. Now look down the hall in the layout department, tell me who we should fire. And those guys didn't like doing that. And they hired other executives like Margaret Lash and people who also didn't really want to fire people. They would much rather repurpose them in another area. And that happened as well. But they never got over being fired from MGM. And plus, moving around in the early days. But the MGM thing was a shock they never got out of. Even though when they were planning Rough and Ready, they were already at MGM as a backup. Because if you're in a job where you're not sure, you always keep your feelers out and your network going just in case. But I honestly don't think they really thought MGM would do that. That was just too successful. But the industry was changing too. It wasn't just MGM. It was every studio, including Disney. The output of shorts just wasn't there anymore. And nobody really could do features with any real success except Disney, and even they could not do new ones except every few years. They had that backlog that they could reissue. And what we grew up with in the 60s and 70s were largely reissues, because they only made a new one every few years. Yeah. But when you went home, your neighbors and your buddies were the Hanna-Barberas. The Disney ones were special people you visited or you saw on holidays. That was event stuff. Hanna-Barberas were pals. And I think one of the points of the book is that one of the most powerful aspects of what Hanna-Barbera did was they rarely skimped on the soundtrack. They might have to cut corners, and as time went on, they had to. But the soundtrack was really, really important. Bill was a musician, and he co-wrote a lot of the themes. Joe worked with him on that, but what Joe was good at was the tonal qualities of voices, to the point where he would hire somebody and then change it. You know, 2 Dr. Quests, 2 Josies, 2 Top Cats, things.
I think Joe, when you look at like how Joe cast voices, I mean, there's almost a musician sort of approach to that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is a music to dialogue. And then they had that great ever-growing cue library. With any show that they had the money for, they would get new cues, either made as cues, like what High Curtain mostly did, or they would be able to post-score 1 or 2 or more 30-minute shows and then cut those into cues. So in the case of Scooby-Doo, you had What a Night for a Night, and that was scored to picture. And it's really fun to watch because you know those cues so well, but then you see what they were supposed to be attached to. And yet the cues are so beautifully written that they still work out of that context. Huckleberry Finn was another show that, because it had a higher budget, had several post-scored ones, and those showed up on a lot, like Josie and Super Friends and a lot of those cartoons. So every few years they'd get a few new cues, but they'd mix them in because there was so much material. They needed music to cover it, and they made tremendous use out of those cues. But they were very unique. You knew they were, and you knew those sound effects really well. Even though they've sort of been released to the world now, you still know a Hanna-Barbera car door, or Fred Flintstone's front door, or a specific crash. Some of those went back to MGM. And you also, they got the great voice people, you know, starting with Dawes Butler and Don Messick, but then you had Janet Waldo and Lenny Weinrib, and then, you know, starting with Scooby, Frank Welker and Casey Kasem and Janet. Oh gosh, I mentioned Janet Waldo. Just you know, a stellar group of people who worked with them on and off for almost the entire time, and it was such a joy to hear them popping up in something, doing a voice. One of my favorite Scoobies is I think it's Headless Horseman. I think Janet Waldo's in that one, because it's like, oh, it's so nice to hear her, you know, in an episode. So that was another thing. It was always, voice work has to be good. Television animation usually recorded all the voices at once because it saved time, but it also created a spontaneity with them all getting energy from each other and bouncing off each other. Features couldn't do that. No, they usually recorded people separately. So in most cases, even Hanna-Barbera's features, theatrical features, were done with everybody in the room, and they had a blast.
I do want to get back to the book shortly, but we are talking kind of about the sort of impact and influence of Hanna-Barbera at the moment. And we're talking about the voice casting, and it made me think about how, you know, so many people who worked sort of on the animation side in the production line, how they spread out into the world. But then also you've got like Gordon Hunt training Andrea Romano, who goes on to do all of those great Warner Brothers animated series. And it's just this legacy that kind of like keeps forward. And I'm seeing more people giving credit to the studio now and the work that was done. Because like a lot of people will say, we wouldn't have the television animation that we have today if it wasn't for Joe and Bill, because they laid the foundation for it. They created the pipelines for it, for better or worse in some cases. And it just, I'm not sure why people don't give them the credit that's kind of due them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That is, and that's something that's bigger just, me or anybody else. I wrote a book, but it shouldn't be the last one. I don't own that information. That's released to the world, and that makes me very happy. It's not really about me. It's about that this stuff's cool. I mean, this stuff is entertaining and fun, but what they did should be taken a little bit more seriously, not analyzing the motivations of what Shaggy did in an episode or some, or what Loopy de Loop or that kind of thing. That not seriously that way. Seriously, like what they did for the entertainment industry and continue to do, because the Flintstones in particular I like to compare it to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, not because you can show them side by side and say, oh, look, they're identical, but because they had a monumental effect on entertainment forever. Because Snow White was a difficult thing to do in a lot of ways, and mostly it was, how do you flesh out a story, keep it moving, have enough action to sustain it, but have enough dialogue, where do you put music, all of those things had to be figured out. And right out of the box, they did it. It's not like Hanna-Barbera had a half-hour show that didn't do well, and then they had the Flintstones. They came right out. That's how good all these people. But until then, no one had done it. And Walt Disney went into features because even in the 30s, a short subject wasn't really taken all that seriously. It was part of the package when an audience went to see the film, with a newsreel and a travelogue and things like that. It was not people. Now, Mickey Mouse was so big at one time that sometimes people did go, and same with Silly Symphonies. And I think with Tom and Jerry too, because Tom and Jerry actually won more Oscars than any other running character short than any other. And I think that they knew that if they didn't do features are critiqued like movies. They are movies. They are in the mainstream of the industry. They are, the reason people go mostly. Same thing with prime time. They could have gone on doing daytime cartoons, but it really was John Mitchell at Screen Gems who kept encouraging them. That's the marketplace. If you can crack prime time and prove it can be done, then the company will expand. And that's what happened with Snow White. Snow White allowed Disney to build the company. Really was all, I know it was started by a mouse, but Snow White opened the studio.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing with the Flintstones. It's not just a matter of, let's make a 7-minute cartoon, like whatever, 26, 27 minutes, just make it longer. You can't do that. So, but you also can't have everybody just talking. That's why it's not like the Honeymooners. It is the basic idea of two couples originally, and the dynamic is similar. But then so is Laurel and Hardy and Sons of the Desert, pointing that out as well. Top Cat, Bilko, yeah, but it's also Damon Runyon. It's even more like Damon Runyon stories than it is like Bilko. And then maybe Bilko's a little like Damon Runyon. So there you go. But what they had to do was figure out a balance between clever dialogue and clever visuals. Now, right away, the first thing that makes it great is the fact that it's the Stone Age and that they had the animals as machines. And the very first one is the one on the cover of my book, the bird that plays a record. And that was the very, very first one. And so you had those as visual gags. You had all of that Stone Age stuff, but you also had to have some kind of action every few seconds to keep it a cartoon. And it's not as easy as it seems. And they kind of perfected it over the years, because the first 2 years of the Flintstones, some people like the best because it was about the couples. But Top Cat was sort of more dialogue, more sophistication, and there maybe was a little bit too much dialogue. I love Top Cat, and it does have some great visuals. But it is a real clever cartoon, and those soundtracks stand on their own, especially with that cast. I think they pushed it to see how far could we push the dialogue, and then you have the Jetsons, which is the best of all possible worlds, because the look and the environment of the Jetsons is as important as the characters are. And then you got Johnny Quest, where they basically invented a genre. I mean, there were really not a lot. There were the Superman Fleischers, in the 40s, but there were not a ton of action adventure cartoons. I mean, unless you count Clutch Cargo, but something on the level of Johnny Quest is immense. So, and the fact that Brad Bird put Johnny Quest in Incredibles 2, and that when you see Jack Jack attack, you hear bum bum bum. It's like these folks know where it came from. I don't think there are people on any of the primetime animated series who would flinch and say, "Oh my gosh, yeah, the Flintstones opened the door." And it still does. And then Hanna-Barbera went on to do 11-minute segments like Wacky Races, 2 of those, 5-minute cartoons like Wally Gator and Touche Turtle. And then the only time that they ever did a 1 hour was Scooby-Doo movies, a 1 hour, one story, unless it was a special based on, a 1 hour special or something, but a weekly, that's a pretty tall order to keep. And the fact that those are watchable, some are better than others, but they're pretty watchable, and that's a lot of time to fill every week.
Yeah, you can tell they're struggling with the length.
Oh, but they don't always. Some of them are good all the way through, and some of them are okay. I know this is padded. It's like, okay, throw in another Shaggy and Scooby, eat something, that kind of thing. But it's the same thing with the features, the direct to videos. There are some that, okay, great setup, and now they're kind of, are they getting me? But then you look at some of them and they're like, this movie holds together very, very well. And that's a difficulty for even theatrical. I mean, how many tons of theatrical animated features come out now, and some of them are good, and some of them are like, they lost me after 20 minutes. I've like seen this before, I kind of know where it's going, and they're not doing a unique twist. I mean, no one will deny Hanna-Barbera went back to the well, but they put other flavors in there, So it wasn't so much, okay, I know that Wally Gator is basically, is like Megillah and all, but there is enough of a difference where they're fun. I know there's going to be they're making a movie episode. There's going to be, they go into outer space episodes, but who cares? Because you want to see what this one does, and I'm not being an apologist, because if you look at even the greatest science fiction and fantasy, or even Westerns, there's only so many storylines. But it's how you maneuver those storylines and give them fresh angles. But there really are only so many, but yet tons of things keep getting created.
I've never really thought about it before. I've always kind of wondered why there were so many, for lack of a better word, kind of copycat characters and or concepts that were kind of recycled. Initially, I just thought, with a case like Scooby-Doo, for example, it's, well, here's a format that works. Like, let's try another show. But listening to you talking, I was kind of thinking about the way episode orders were back then, where you got your first order, which was like 13 episodes or whatever, and then
yes,
the
16 or 17, yeah,
would be like 8.
Right.
And so, that's why Josie and the Pussycats went to outer space, because we could get more episodes if we changed the concept and create a new show. So I'm kind of wondering now if some of those recycled ideas were just a way of like continuing a show that maybe basically it wouldn't have been financially kind of beneficial to the studio to continue doing show A, but the concept was a solid concept. So just kind of spin it into something new and then continue on with that. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of factors involved there. First of all, I don't think there were and are people involved with making these films that are lacking for talent. I think that they all can come up with great concepts. It's the journey from the initial concept to the script and the board and all that, getting past all of the other layers. Whenever I see a movie and think, wow, that could have been so good, I have to wonder, what was the first draft of the script like, and what was compared to what we ended up seeing, and how many people, rework this or rework that or brought in that person or that person. I mean, I was a writer, an advertising writer for 30 years at Disney, and I still freelance and for various companies. And it just depends on the project. But when you're in a big corporate organization, you have to your job is to find great ways of communicating what they want you to communicate, but you're also kind of in a situation where you really have to accept a lot of revisions and find a way to make them work. I mean, you can't say no all the time, you know,
I
if you
guess
want to.
they're also dealing with the network and the sponsors too.
And the pressure groups. You know, Super Friends, you know, there's a show that Scooby-Doo made possible. In fact, Scooby-Doo with Batman really, I mean, the Brady kids had Wonder Woman and stuff, but Scooby-Doo with Batman proved that they could have superheroes again and still keep the group satisfied. And and Super Friends is a great example of that because there's action and yet there's it's still, you know, how in the world do you solve that problem? And yet they did. That's how talented these folks were. You could only imagine if there wasn't. But on the other hand, sometimes creativity comes from restrictions. You know, if you look at certain low budget things and you think, gee, this was more entertaining than something that was millions and millions of dollars that had money thrown at the screen. So it can go either way. But I just think that under all of those circumstances, those shows are truly remarkable. Also to address the idea of repetition, Barbera would get frustrated because he knew what he and his people could do and what Bill could get out at any, you know, at miracle timelines. But the networks wanted what sold. And they're looking at ledgers and pie charts and graphs and saying, you know, teens solving mysteries sells, or cute little adorable characters in a fanciful setting sells, or making a grown-up character into a baby or a teen sells. And that's kind of always been the mindset. You've got to get the front office happy, so they're the ones with the money and they're the ones that greenlight it. And the more you can make them feel comfortable and confident that it's going to do well for them, the more that's going to happen. I think it's Barton Fink that has a scene with all of these people pitching, and it's like this, only it's like this, you know, and it's always that. And that's kind of how you pitch things sometimes, because you've got to get something that the people you're presenting to relate to and know what it is. You know, you can't say it's like Sartre or like, you know, I mean, I was in a meeting where most of the people in the room didn't know what Gulliver's Travels was because I used the word Lilliputian. It totally threw them. You know, it was like, what's that? It's like Gulliver's Travels, you know. No. So, and these are brilliant people. It's just that not all of us have read a lot of things or have that time or have seen the same things. And it's even more of an issue now because everybody's out looking at all kinds of stuff. But you have to take into consideration and respect that there's all those people involved there. And Hanna-Barbera was able to survive and still do creditable work longer than any one of these companies did. And I also like to point out that the more boutique-y of the studios sometimes had to find themselves suddenly doing that system as well. UPA started out as probably the greatest boutique of them all with almost fine modern art cartoons, but eventually they ended up doing, you know, 120 Dick Tracy's for 5 minutes, 120 Mr. Magoo's, and I love them, but they're not like the theatrical Magoo's because those were handcrafted over like 2 months. These were done very rapidly. Same thing with Paramount. You know, Paramount, even after Fleischer, their cartoons were gorgeous in the 40s and 50s, but then into the late 50s and the early 60s, the Paramount cartoons resemble the Felix the Cat cartoons and the Beetle Bailey cartoons. Wonderfully entertaining, but no different than what Hanna-Barbera was doing, and probably not quite there. To Patty Freeling, you know, Pink Panther, those were the greatest. After a while, they didn't have the deal where they could just do a few at a time, and they had to get 100 on one season, and then suddenly you have, you know, and cartoons I like, you know, Blue Racer and The Dogfather and what's the other one, Hoot Kloot, and a lot of things that not everybody remembers, but they ended up in the same boat. and Warner itself. If you look at when they laid off almost all our animators, suddenly DePatie Freeling is making them, Format Films is making them, and the Warner, the Daffy and Speedy ones are, and even some of the very late Bugs ones are, if you compare that to a Huckleberry Hound or even a McGilla Gorilla, it's everybody has to survive in a different way. But Hanna-Barbera consistently succeeded. Yeah, excuse me, they had some one-season wonders, just like everyone did. But they still play, and people are shocked. How come there's only 16 of those? How come there's only, because that's all they would let them make on Saturday morning. But they're still, and how come there are only 24 Jetsons? Animation's expensive. The ratings weren't such that ABC wanted to pay $10,000 to $20,000 more for a Jetsons or a Johnny Quest when they could get a live action show that cost a fraction of that, and then they keep the money. It's just math. One of the things, because I've been teaching a lot of online things about Hanna-Barbera and about television and escapism and music and stuff. One of the things that occurred to me is the Flintstones is significant in another way. If you look at TV and the high concept escapist shows of the 60s, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, Gilligan, Flying Nun, those shows, My Favorite Martian, there weren't many of those before 1960. There was only Topper, based on the movie, in like 52, 53, but there really weren't those sort of things. Walt Disney tried to bring that kind of thing to TV with the Shaggy Dog. That was sold as a pilot, or as a pilot idea. ABC wouldn't buy it. And in 1959, that movie was a massive success, more than Sleeping Beauty. So suddenly you got Walt Disney looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, we can't make these features all the time. They're very risky. They lowered the budget on Disney features because they use Xerox in Dalmatians and stuff, and sometimes recycled animation. Still great films, but not on that level anymore. They just couldn't do it. But he also very wisely thought, okay, let's make live action movies that are like cartoons, because Shaggy Dog was a huge hit. Absent Mind Professor is that kind of film, and that was 1960, 61. TV hadn't started doing it yet. Then the Flintstones goes on ABC. Suddenly they greenlight that, and it's essentially a fantasy show, but pretty expensive. And the Flintstones was really successful, so it stayed on for 6 seasons. But little by little, Walt Disney's putting out the Son of Flubber and Merlin Jones, and they're all basically TV budget films, but they're doing really well. And suddenly it occurs to the networks, hey, wait a minute, Mr. Ed comes on in 61, My Favorite Martian, Bewitched in 64, and suddenly it's like, wait a minute, we can do that same kind of escapism without paying the enormous price and the long production, thing of animation. So I think by the time, the reason the Jetsons and all those also was like, well, we can kind of do this thing much cheaper without it being a cartoon. And it's exactly what Walt Disney was doing. Because if you look at the 60s and 70s, tons of Herbie kind of movies, which were, fun, but lower budget, and very few cartoons. That's what the networks were doing. And it really started with the Flintstones. Everything else came after that. So there you go. They set the trend. They did it with Scooby again. They did it with Smurfs in the 80s. NBC didn't want to, they were terrified of running the Smurfs. No one had ever done it. Suddenly everyone's imitating it. So there you go.
It's interesting. I've never really considered, this is part of why I like having these conversations, because they open the doors in the mind. So I was born in 73, so I grew up watching all of my Warner Brothers cartoons on like the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show. To me, they were TV cartoons.
Yeah.
And the Hanna-Barbera cartoons at the same time were the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. They were cartoons that were primarily produced for television. The Warner Brothers cartoons were patched together theatrical shorts. So I kind of wonder if like the perception that a lot of people have about Hanna-Barbera stuff just not being as good is because when you see these things like the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, where we're being introduced to them, they're theatrical shorts, they're high quality, money has been spent on them, and then you're comparing them to the other thing on the other channel, and you're going, well, these are obviously much better.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
I think you're right.
and that carries with you as you move on. And like in a way, you could argue like Warner Brothers, once they shut down their animation stuff, like there was a long stretch where they just really weren't doing much other than cutting and pasting these theatrical cartoons together in features or on television. And it really wasn't until, Spielberg came in and got them to put together Tiny Toons that Warner Brothers had another kind of golden age of animation. And I think because of the way the cartoons looked and they were the cartoons that we loved, we don't feel that like dark age, that that period of that drought. Whereas because Hanna-Barbera was still like producing and churning out content of varying quality, I wonder if that somehow worked like against them. You know what I mean?
Oh, I do agree with you. I think, first of all, I think that Hanna-Barbera didn't have a brand image. They didn't have that. They didn't call it that then. In the late 50s, early 60s, and until probably the late 70s, that was a household name. Rankin Bass didn't either. Rankin Bass has become sort of the word that means stop motion TV, Hollywood. It's Rankin Bass like. Even that has an ID. Hanna-Barbera became more of a household word when the lower cost animation was being made and a ton of Scoobies were being made, and it was circumstances more than anything else because that's what was selling. So people, and then when Smurfs came along, a lot of people didn't even know they made that because it had such a completely different look. It showed what they were capable of. It also showed bringing in somebody like Gerard Baldwin, who worked for UPA and for Jay Ward, just how much of an impact it could have. And they would do that. Scott Shaw, who worked for them for long, he did the Ed Grimley cartoon, which I think they should have run at night or after the news. It should not have been on Saturday because it's a great show. It's a great cartoon. But they didn't know what they had. A lot of times they don't. But in the case of Hanna-Barbera, people didn't know what anyone looked like. People didn't know Bill Hanna was on To Tell the Truth and was not picked. And they only did a few appearances, really hardly any when you think about it. So Walt Disney was brilliant at the name Disney meaning something. So and I know I do a lot of comparisons, but I think it's relevant because when Disney films had to be cheaper during the war, and they were making these things called package films where there was 6 or 7 short cartoons in one feature. Lovely cartoons, but nowhere near what Bambi or Snow White or Pinocchio were. It said Walt Disney Presents, and while you might walk out thinking, well, that wasn't quite, but it was Disney, and I love what Disney does. And then as you went into the 50s, suddenly there's Disney television shows. A lot of Westerns, a lot of animal films, True Life Adventures. True Life Adventures is a brilliant idea because it's 16 millimeter footage blown up to 35, very low cost, but they found an entertaining way to tell stories with, thousands of feet of film and link it together. And that served them well all the way through the 70s and 80s with the Sunday night show. Because if you recall, Sunday night show rarely had animation on it. And when it did, it was either the Christmas show or it was Johnny Appleseed or Sleepy Hollow. They were very, very sparing with what they showed on TV. And so you still thought of Disney as, oh, this special thing. But the Sunday night show got more dependent on the animal shows because they were done, in Canada at very, very low budgets. But because it was Disney and it was always top notch, even when the budget was low, you always forgave that and thought, well, but it's Disney. Hanna-Barbera didn't create that name that you look toward, even though they were more worthy of it than they deserved to be. They didn't really get known until the late 70s. And then critics, animation was starting to get analyzed, and the golden age was the golden age, and TV, was the junk and what ruined everything. And, but when you talk about the Warners and what you saw on the Warners, as a kid, you weren't aware of chronology. I mean, one of the things I think is helpful to people with the book I wrote is suddenly you're seeing where these cartoon shows lie in relation to one another and why, you know, Jetsons in 62 isn't the same as Jetsons in 85, and why it's very difficult to make a comparison, because it's a different studio as time went by, but so was Disney. And so by the 70s, you still had that image of a Walt Disney Presents Lady and the Tramp or Cinderella, because those kept getting reissued, reinforcing, and then the theme parks, you know, by the 70s on both coasts, reinforcing that. I mean, Disney is a monolith. Hanna-Barbera is a much smaller company, but as an animation company, a lot more people worked on cartoons there. So it wasn't really fair, but it just sort of worked out that way. The other thing, in fact, it wasn't really branded until Fred Seibert became the first president of Hanna-Barbera after Bill and Joe pretty much retired. They were there, they still came into work every day until they were not well enough to. But he was the first to brand it, and he came from MTV and Nick at Night and all that, and he knew how to do it. And that's where the Hanna-Barbera cartoons came from, and the, you know, da 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 da, you know, at the end and all, and the What a Cartoon. And it branched off into its own animal when Cartoon Network came along, which was a good thing and not such a good thing, because Cartoon Network put their name over Hanna-Barbera's, which is like putting, you know, Betty Crocker over Walt Disney's name or something. But they must have done research, and research can be skewed however you want, and said, well, we don't know if this, you know, we want to have a lot of wonderful people did it. I'm sure they had great reason to do it, but it erased their name for a good amount of years. And
I do think that they would have, in the same way that I said, like Warner Brothers had that second golden age with the Spielberg cartoons, Hanna-Barbera basically had a second golden age with the Cartoon Network stuff, because all of that stuff was born of Hanna-Barbera properties, the What a Cartoon.
But Hanna-Barbera, the early What a Cartoons were Hanna-Barbera productions. Dexter's Laboratory and Powerpuff Girls and Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken. Those were Hanna-Barbera cartoons, but somebody said, we're going to make this a uniform brand. And what started out as Hanna-Barbera, huge library, being the heart and soul of Cartoon Network, suddenly it inverted, and suddenly this is that other stuff we're just going to glue the name on. And I think for at least a generation, suddenly nobody knew who made what anymore. And it's hard nowadays. It's hard nowadays with acquisitions being what they are, whose property is where and where it originated and things like that. It wasn't as difficult in the early days because things were just, you know, everything has gotten so huge. But that, I think, had an effect on it. And they just only recently started, well, not recently, but in the last 10, 15 years, started putting their name onto things again. But when you watched the Flintstones, when you watched Johnny Quest, when you watched Scooby-Doo, you saw Hanna-Barbera at the end. The only show I can think of where it says Hanna-Barbera Presents at the beginning is certain episodes of Frankenstein Jr. and the Impossibles, but not all of them. And I'll give you another example of why I think this is true. Sid and Marty Krofft met Walt Disney at a dinner once, and Walt gave them the advice of always put your name first. People know your name, they know what, and he knew this. And people know who Sid and Marty Krofft is, and immediately they know what they did, the kind of stuff they did. And some of their stuff was better than others, but you knew with Krofft you were going to get sort of kitschy, you know, loose, nutty, mind blower, weirdo stuff. But you knew what they did. Hanna-Barbera didn't do that. Maybe they weren't permitted to because of screen jumps. I don't know. The only time they put the presents, other than at the beginning of that, is like on the Secret Squirrel Adam Ant show. The individual cartoons said it. To people like me who love the records, it said it on the records. I knew, you know, but I don't think the general public knew or cared. And, you know, they didn't know who Filmation was really either, or the Patty Freeling, though their names were at the open in the theatrical cartoons, not on the TV. And that has a huge, you know, every brand is a very huge thing now. And I think that's the reason why, because a brand has to have expectations that are, that it serves, and things that don't serve it shouldn't be there. And the brand can also cover a multitude, I'm not going to say a multitude of sins, but a multitude of different kinds and different levels of production. If you trust that brand, you know that this may not be your cup of tea, or this may not be as lavish as something else, but you know what that brand will give you, and
Yeah.
I don't think they ever had that. And
When I was a teenager and I saw the banana splits for the first time, I was like, oh, this is a Sid and Marty Krofft thing.
people still do that. They do that online all the time.
And like, to be fair, Sid and Marty Krofft were involved, but like it's a Hanna-Barbera project.
Yeah, and the costumes were constructed by the Crofts, and I think maybe even the sets, because they looked very Crofty. But the looks of the banana splits, those were like Jerry Eisenberg and Iwa Takamoto and those people who designed characters, because you can tell from those characters. But there's another example of what you said earlier. The success of banana splits brought the Crofts to the attention of NBC. They were already renowned for their work in stage shows and theme parks and stuff. And they said, make a show, pitch us a show. They sold HR Puff and stuff, didn't know how to make a TV show. Actually, the story is that they sent their secretary, Trudy Bennett, to the store to buy a book, How to Make a TV Show. And HR Puff and stuff was wildly over budget. That's why it's on film and it looks so much more lavish than anything that came later. It's because they didn't know any better and they almost went broke. But the Puff and Stuff movie, which cost only like $900,000, made tons of money for Universal. So it saved them. But without Hanna-Barbera making the banana splits and hiring them, there you go. So they did a lot of stuff that will continue to, and the characters are going to keep popping up and things, and you can say, well, it's not as good as a Jellystone. In some ways,
I love Jellystone.
In some ways, it's like, I don't know if I would have, put so much body noises in it, but if that's the worst thing they do on Jellystone, who cares? Because they have so many obscure characters in it. I interviewed the creator of it. This is not made by people who never saw these cartoons. This is made by people who love them and want to get as many of those characters in there. I mean, when they started talking about, Nugget Nose and that's cool. And so they did what they had to do to make it, as they would say, relevant to today's modern audiences, and relevant to today's more modern approval groups of people in that world, which is a reality. But they also made it, they did. I mean, Huckleberry Hound has never had so much to do.
Yeah.
In a cartoon since. I mean, he sings Clementine and then he goes away. He's the mayor. I mean, it was a great idea. So a lot of that, I don't have a problem with that. It just keeps them out there. The directive videos, the one they did with the Flintstones and the wrestlers.
Right.
If the Flintstones never went off the air, they would have had wrestlers on there because that's what kids like. And the look of that cartoon was spot on. These are people like Spike Brandt and Tony Cervone who really work hard to be as faithful as they can under, again, extreme circumstances. Johnny, Tom and Jerry Spy Quest.
I'm amazed at how good that movie is.
And here's
it shouldn't work, but it does.
No, it does. And that opening, you if you didn't know, you'd think it was a vintage Tom and Jerry. It's so beautifully done. And part of that is that what a lot of folks, and I didn't know about direct-to-video and a lot of TV animation, is yes, it's outsourced, but not all of it. So when they want something really special, like a musical number or something that's intricate, they will have some of Hollywood's best animators do that part and send some of the other stuff overseas. That's why the direct-to-videos and the made-for-TV seem kind of uneven, because they're cherry picking the I'll give you an example that Spike told me, the Slugworth song in Tom and Jerry Willy Wonka, and there's again, give them the assignment, make this work. They made it work. In fact, my son thinks the boat ride scarier in that than it is in the original. But the scene where the song that Slugworth sings, excuse me, Dear Evan Hansen and La La Land, same composers. They run around talking about that, but they they put a lot of elaborate stuff into that. Same with Heidi's song. You know, the song that Sammy Davis does, The Rat, that's done on ones. You know, that's really cool. It's really interesting to see where they did get a little extra money and how they used it. There's a Hanna-Barbera was trying to do what Disney did in the 70s and with AIP, American International, and make it only resulted in one, make a wacky comedy kind of thing, you know, or Herbie kind of movie. And they made one called Chomps,
Oh yeah.
Canine Home Protection System with Valerie Bertinelli. And it's okay. The movie's okay. But the opening titles are incredible. You know, watch them on YouTube. This is like if another company made this, they'd go, oh, they'd rave about it, you know. And that's your point, and my point is I like I said, it ain't about me. I'm just a guy who wrote a book and listens to, you know, Flintstones. But if this and the podcast I'm doing and these interviews I'm doing bring that more for people, I think I just love for those who seem to be overlooked to not be overlooked, you know?
I think it might be Hanna-Barbera's time, because like when you think about animation scholarship, like Disney was kind of probably the first major focus because they're Disney. And then you had these upstart academics who are like, Warner Brothers, you know, the Warner Brothers, these aren't just goofy slapstick, you know, farcical things. These are art. And so like the Warner Brothers stuff got elevated. And we're now in a time where, you know, talking to people and even myself, like I look at stuff and a lot of the comments are there's just not a lot of books out there. There's not a lot of like proper scholarship looking at the HB stuff. But I think that's turning around. And I think people are starting to see that that is like a shortfall in the narrative and they're moving to fill it. And somebody who was recently on your podcast has a Scooby-Doo book.
Yeah, that's Kevin Sandler, and he's working on that. And I was just talking to Tyler Solon Williams, who did the book with him, the Hanna-Barbera Conversations, which is also a major book because right. they really had to dig to get articles and portions of books, some of which you can't find, like the one about the acquisition of Taft. You know, I was searching for that forever, but
they had to get permission from the family or something, right?
Well, yeah, in many cases they did. There's a show called Stu Show. They got permission from Stu Showstack to use the interview with Ruby and Spears, and so some of it had to be purchased. Some of it was a gift, but the main thing is it's all in one book for the first time, and it offers you as a lot more detailed information than there was in a book, and so that's exactly right. It's if this keeps going, that's what's important because their output was so vast that you can focus. You know, I'm doing podcasts like with the great Jim Fanning, who is a historian. We did one on Huck Finn. We had no idea how long we'd be talking about it because, you know, when you look at that's an example of a show that is either forgotten or, oh, I like that. It was not on the Banana Splits. Well, yeah, in syndication it was. But when you look at how ambitious it was and how it had a different art direction every week, and again, how really expensive it was. Okay, it's not Mary Poppins. It can't be Mary Poppins. Not a weekly show. You know, but you couldn't do that once a week, you know. So they were sometimes more ambitious than they were necessarily able to deliver, but they still did it. So taking risks like that should be admired.
They kind of did the R&D.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, because what I do think is there's a Gene Kelly movie, Invitation to the Dance, that has an extended different 3 or 4 dance sequences with it's like Fantasia, only with like Gene Kelly dance things that he directed, and the last one is Sinbad the Sailor, and it has a lot of famous moments, especially the dance with the palace guards and with the snake. But there are a lot of imperfections because there's so much that they tried. Moving the camera, you got to be real careful moving the camera, because a live actor in relation to what's animated, it's very difficult to keep it in register. And Bedknobs and Broomsticks, one of my favorite movies, when Angela Lansbury is holding the loving cup, ain't perfect, but I don't care. But it ain't perfect because she turns, and that's really, really hard to do. Well, in Sinbad the Sailor, there was a lot of that, because they would move the camera up, or he would change his position, or there was a lot. They tried to go as far as they could. And I guarantee you that other studios, including Disney, 'cause Disney had a screening room in his home and enjoyed the MGM films. You can tell he must have been thrilled. He was thrilled to hire people like Jane Darwell and Pola Negri and all these great character actors, and Sally Benson, who wrote Meet Me in St. Louis. He was a fan of great Hollywood films. He had to have watched this stuff probably with the artist and said, okay, now we kind of know, let's not go there. Let's beef up this. And if you look at Mary Poppins, Dick Van Dyke, the only time he really comes into direct contact with the penguins, which is very risky, is when he slides them off of his cane, and it's a very fast move. But, and they bump up against them, very rapid, very rapid. It's mostly a lockdown camera and so they analyze brilliantly every single thing that would work perfectly and went with that and didn't go off on stuff that wasn't worth, doing. And that's why that's so beautifully done. Now, but if you go back to Anchors Aweigh, that was still perfection, and they still did stuff that you can't believe they did.
Yeah.
Because it was MGM in 1945 or 44. The budget was immense. This equipment was new. And I still look at that and I marvel at how beautifully it's done. And even in that, at the beginning, when there's a little birdie in the tree and stuff, there's a move forward. There's a little movement there that, it's very difficult to do. And Roger Rabbit possibly is the ultimate, but on the other hand, Roger Rabbit had mechanics and puppetry, and it had computers that could enhance things. It had, there were a lot of things they did in that they used a technology that didn't exist in those days. So but people don't think of Hanna-Barbera when it comes to that, and yet they did tons of it.
Yeah. And there you have it. That concludes part 1 of my conversation with writer and podcaster Greg Ehrbar. If you want to connect with Greg's broader body of work, you can check out his website at gregovision.com. You can also check out his podcasts, the Funtastic World of Hanna and Barbera, or the Pop Culture Classics podcast, accessing it either through Greg's website or wherever good pods are cast. I want to thank you for supporting my show, streaming and downloading this episode, however you're accessing it, through whatever provider you're accessing it from. And if you want to continue supporting the show, you can also follow, subscribe, whatever button pushes are the norm for wherever you are getting the podcast. And if there is an opportunity to rate or review the show, that would also be helpful. It does help with the algorithms and getting the show in front of the eyes and into the ears of people who may not know that I exist and who may enjoy the kind of content that I provide. For anybody who followed me on social media, the X account is essentially dead. I am still holding on to the name just so it doesn't get sucked up by anybody else or whatever. I have properly moved over to Blue Sky. It is still a podcast named Scooby-Doo. So if you do frequent Blue Sky or you do have an account, feel free to check me out over there. I haven't really gone full in on the social media yet. I'm kind of focusing on just getting episodes out. So not a lot going on, but who knows? If a bunch of people start connecting with me on social media, I might just have to be a little bit more engaged on there. So hopefully we'll see you over there. And with that, that'll be it for me today. As for part 2, this episode wasn't really supposed to come out yet. It also wasn't supposed to be 2 parts. I do have another show in the pipeline, hasn't been recorded yet. It was supposed to come out and essentially be like my October reemergence. But the conversation with Greg just went really well. It was really fun, and the editing was so easy. It just got me excited, and I just kind of wanted to rush something out. Like I said, the two-parter is kind of biting me in the ass a little bit here, but ultimately, I'm going to try and get part 2 out for next week. Depending on how things go, it might end up being 2 or 3 weeks. I don't want to leave you kind of dangling in the wind, and out of respect to Greg, I don't want to, just leave that second episode hanging. So I am going to make a point of getting it out there. Just if you'll be patient, and I'll keep you posted with what is going on the social media. Yeah, and we'll get part 2 to you. And that other episode in the pipeline is, I think it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be something that people are going to enjoy. And it's, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. So again, thank you all so much for supporting the show. Thanks for checking this episode out. Wherever you are, take care. I hope you're safe. I hope you're healthy. And we will see you next time on a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
His name is Kyle! Hovering balladeer! Kyle! Everybody cheer! This is how we solve the mystery. This is how we solve the mystery. So in summation, this narration's my donation to the art of mystery solving dictation. And here's what the bad guys say when they play where the law forbids.
Would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
This is how we solve the mystery. Bye.